Welcome to our deep dive today. You sent in some really interesting stuff, analysis of Biden's 2023 State of the Union and Trump's 2025 address to Congress, and like a ton of fact-checking articles.
Yeah.
What I'm really curious about is like how much of what they said actually holds up, like when you look at the fact checks and all that.
Yeah, and, we'll look at some of the moments where Congress just went silent, because sometimes what's not said is even more interesting, wouldn't you say?
Totally. So let's start with Biden's 2023 State of the Union.
Okay.
He made a really big deal about reducing the deficit, right? Like, he claimed it was a record $1.7 trillion.
Right.
It sounds impressive, but then you look into those fact checks and...
Yeah, and that's where it gets interesting. Fact checkers from CNN, The Washington Post, even factcheck.org, which tries to stay super neutral, they all said that Biden was leaving out some really important context.
So he wasn't exactly lying.
Exactly. The deficit did go down, but it was mostly because a lot of that pandemic spending just expired. The Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan people who do the numbers for Congress, they'd already predicted that drop before Biden even took office. And then on top of that, his policies actually added to the debt over the long term.
Oh, wow. So how much are we talking about?
Well, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, they're a watchdog group that keeps an eye on government spending, estimated that Biden's policies would add around $4.8 trillion to the debt by 2031.
Wow.
That's a really big number, and it kind of puts that $1.7 trillion reduction in a whole new light.
Yeah, it makes you think about, like, how things are framed, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about the numbers themselves, but the context.
Exactly, and how they're compared. Biden also took a shot at Trump during his speech, saying that deficits rose under his administration, which is technically true. The national debt did go up under Trump, but Biden left out a pretty big piece of information.
Let me guess, the pandemic.
Exactly. A huge chunk of that debt increase came from bipartisan pandemic spending, the stimulus checks, the business loans, all of that. It was just this massive, unprecedented situation that totally impacted spending under both presidents.
Yeah.
In fact, factcheck.org pointed out that before the pandemic hit, Trump's deficits were actually lower than any under Biden so far.
Wow. So much for that talking point. It's like, do they think we don't remember what happened during the pandemic? It feels a little...
Right. It's kind of like they're cherry picking the data points that fit their narrative instead of just giving us the whole picture.
Okay. So lesson one for everyone listening, always look beyond those flashy headlines and dig into the details for yourselves.
I'm sure.
Now let's fast forward to Trump's 2025 address. You flagged some interesting silences from Congress, especially when he talked about tariffs.
Yes. This was right after he put those controversial tariffs on Canada and Mexico, remember? Markets were freaking out. And even some Republicans were starting to get nervous. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, he was one of them. He had some pretty serious concerns.
Yeah. Trump was still pushing that whole idea that tariffs would make America rich again, wasn't he?
That was his main argument. But most economists, and we're talking across the political spectrum here, disagreed with him. They see tariffs as basically a tax hike that ends up hurting the economy and making prices go up for everyone.
Yeah, there was that Yale study, right? The one that tried to project how much Trump's tariffs would actually cost people?
Exactly. The Yale University Budget Lab estimated that Trump's tariffs would increase inflation by a whole percentage point while also cutting economic growth by half a percentage point. And for the average family, that translates to a cost of about $1,600.
Ouch, that's gotta hurt. So back to those congressional silences. You said they were really noticeable when Trump talked about tariffs.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Republicans, who are usually Trump's biggest fans, were suddenly quiet. It was strange.
Really?
Democrats, on the other hand, responded with what the New York Times called withering laughter.
It definitely felt like there were some big disagreements brewing under the surface.
You know what this whole thing reminds me of? That saying actions speak louder than words? Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Sometimes those non-reactions, those moments of silence, can tell you more than any big speech.
Right, because it's what they're not saying.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like everyone in Congress was playing poker, and those silences were their tells.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And remember, we're not just talking about any silences. We're talking about moments where you'd expect a really strong reaction, especially from the Republicans, who are usually so loud in their support for Trump.
Right.
Like, take the Social Security issue, for instance.
You mean those claims about fraud based on that whole COBOL coding mess? Yeah, that one seemed like it'd be a home run for Trump. Social Security is huge for so many voters, especially the ones who depend on it for retirement.
Exactly. It's a program that's really popular with both Democrats and Republicans. But when Trump brought it up, the GOP side of the chamber was weirdly quiet. The New York Times even described it as barely a stir.
That is surprising. What do you think was going on there? Do you think they were worried about alienating their base by even suggesting that there might be problems with Social Security?
It's definitely possible. Any talk about cuts or big changes to Social Security is like walking into a political minefield, even for someone like Trump. The GOP might have realized that going along with his claims could really backfire on them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They were probably thinking, let's just stay away from this one.
It's like they knew this was a third rail they did not want to touch. They were sending a message with their silence like, we hear you, but we're not going there.
Exactly. And then there's the silence that wasn't about what Trump said, but about who was in the audience. Elon Musk.
Oh, yeah, the Elon Musk sighting. That was a pretty big deal. He's not exactly your average congressional guest, is he?
No, he's not.
Yeah.
And remember, this wasn't just some random celebrity appearance.
Yeah.
Musk had been really outspoken in his criticism of government regulations, and Trump was obviously showing his support by giving him a front row seat.
So when Trump started going off about unelected bureaucrats, the people who actually write and enforce those regulations, the Democrats in the chamber all looked right at Musk.
The look on everyone's faces in that moment was priceless Democrats staring down Musk, who's just sitting there looking smug, while Trump's railing against the very people Musk wants to see less of.
The New York Times called it a most Washington look for the man currently razing Washington to the ground. It was like they were all silently saying, look who's talking.
It really captured the tension between the people who believe government regulation is necessary to protect consumers, workers, and the environment, and the people who see it as a roadblock to innovation and economic growth.
And it all comes back to those silences, right? They make you think critically about what's really happening behind the scenes, who's aligned with who, whose interests are being served.
Just like peeling back the layers of an onion. The speeches themselves are just the surface. The real story is in those subtle cues, those moments of hesitation, those silences that tell the real story about the power dynamics at play.
It makes you wonder, what else are they not telling us?
Right. That's the big question.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to pay attention to these things, to read between the lines, to listen for those silences that speak volumes.
Because sometimes those silences are more informative than any carefully written speech. We've talked about how these presidential addresses, whether it's Biden talking about the deficit or Trump's promises about tariffs, they often present a very selective version of reality.
Yeah, and we've seen how those moments of silence from Congress, especially on touchy subjects like Social Security and government regulation, they can show us the cracks in the usual partisan lines and give us a peek at the real pressure points in the political landscape.
But what does all this mean for us, the listeners? How can we actually use this knowledge to make sense of the political world and make good decisions? I mean, it feels like we're just drowning in information all the time, Speeches, news articles, social media. It's like, how do you even know what to believe anymore?
It's true. It really is.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to get caught up in all the hype, especially with complicated stuff like the economy or government policy. But what we've been talking about today are actually some pretty good tools you can use to cut through all the BS and figure things out for yourself.
Yeah, like being aware of those silences, those times when people aren't saying what you think they should be saying. It's like a big warning sign going off, hey, pay attention. There's something more going on here.
Exactly. Those silences can be a sign that there are disagreements behind the scenes or conflicts of interest, or maybe even some secret deals happening that we don't know about. It reminds us that in politics, things aren't always what they seem on the surface.
So we can't just sit back and swallow everything we're told, right?
Yeah.
We have to actually think about it, ask questions, and look for those hidden meanings.
Absolutely. That's the whole point.
Actually,
You have to become a more critical thinker. Yeah. Don't just accept things at face value. Dig a little deeper. Consider different points of view and try to understand why people are saying what they're saying.
It's like being a detective, almost, right? You have to gather the evidence, look for clues, and put the pieces together to see the bigger picture.
I love that analogy. And one of the biggest clues you can find are those moments of silence, those things that people aren't saying. That's where you'll often find the most important insights.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. We've gone from Biden's record deficit reduction to Trump's tariff promises, uncovered this whole hidden world of ancient computer code running Social Security, and even had a surprise cameo from Elon Musk.
And through it all, we've seen how these seemingly tiny moments of silence can actually reveal a lot about what's really going on in terms of power and political strategy.
So to all our listeners out there, the next time you're listening to a political speech or reading a news article or even just scrolling through social media, remember what we talked about today. Question everything. Think about the context and pay attention to those silences. They just might be the key to understanding the whole story.